The second session started right away with a discussion group. And the question that was asked is, discuss problems and difficulties, identify causes, both internal and external. What can we change? What can't we change?
Okay. So who's feeding back for group one?
I'm going to find it different. I don't know what group I was in now.
We were in group 2, babe.
2, right.
Okay, who's feeding back from group 2? We'll do that first.
Shall I do it? Because I'm chatty one.
Please do.
So we were talking about the clinging on to things. We were talking about like very different scenarios for me and Susan, because obviously initially we thought it was just me and Susan, about clinging on to the people we were before certain things happened, and how sometimes it's because letting go is scarier, and it's like also letting go of negative people, because you can't change them, you can only change how you react to them. So we were talking about that, and then I was relating a story about something that happened to me at work where I was assaulted by a patient, and then Jana came in, we were talking, and she was saying about what positives could I take, and how I felt about the patient that hurt me. And I said I actually didn't feel any bad towards him, because he wasn't well, he wasn't in his right mind. And I ended up sitting on his bed giving him a cuddle while he cried his legs off a few days later. So yes, we were talking about, it was a good discussion. I think Bernard came in as well, and he was just saying about sometimes it's the small things that sort of the subtle negative energies that kind of build up, and then it just takes one thing to knock you off. But yeah, it was really good.
No, thanks. That's a really good point. It's also an inspiring example of you talking about the person with your work. Because it isn't always easy, that, is it? What do you do exactly, Zoe?
I'm a staff nurse.
Right, that's wrong.
And I work on the wards, and that's what I love doing. I've been qualified 15 years. I don't want to be a sister or a manager or anything like that. I love being on the wards, I love teaching students, looking after the medical staff, working lots of nights. But it's not something I'm going to be able to go back to, because I got hurt, my neck got hurt, and then when I came back, I fell in the middle of the pandemic. I fell over and I've torn my leg. So, but it's about like letting that person go, that nurse who worked on the ward, that one that walked on the ward, and you know what I mean, I owned it. So yeah, that would be my struggle, and it's been, it's hard.
Right. Thanks for sharing that. That's great. Does anybody want to talk from group one?
I'll talk if you want, but I think Elizabeth put her hand up that she wanted to.
Elizabeth.
No, Elizabeth, is that not true?
Did you, Elizabeth?
I thought you were volunteering, Claire. So
yes. So
would you like to start, and I would see if we want to Rachel,
then you can join it.
Okay. You want to join it?
That's a good idea. Our group talked a lot about the suffering of change, the difficulties that has given us, and the huge amount of change that has been in the last years in society with Brexit, and how that's caused a divide between people, and also now with COVID, and the feeling of being, well, the lockdown feeling is very difficult for a lot of us. We talked about the change of health, and dealing with the change of our own bodies and our own situations. And I don't know, perhaps Elizabeth, is there anything else you want to add to that?
And as Rachel mentioned it as well, that I've mentioned that impermanence, and how impermanence was difficult to deal with, or that sensation of impermanence, that feeling. But Rachel was, we were talking about from COVID, having to deal with the change at work, and from a negative situation, how to transmute it into something positive. And there is always something positive in the negative, and how from, I often say, from after darkness comes the sunshine. Anything else, Rachel or Toral?
No, that was great. Thanks. Does anybody else want to comment at all from either of the groups and bring anything in or share anything?
Attachment came up quite strongly.
Right.
And impermanence. Yeah, that's right, girls.
Yeah, no, good. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing. We will be mixing the groups up as we go along. I mean, there's some really interesting stuff there. Obviously, I've already commented on Zoe's. I mean, again, it's interesting talking about things like COVID and Brexit, isn't it? There's been an enormous amount going on around us that's triggering all sorts of problems. I think in everybody's minds, one way or another, it's been difficult for everybody, hasn't it? I mean, I still struggle with Brexit, I'll be honest. That's been a real challenge for me personally, I think, accepting Brexit.
I think it raised for everyone, everybody, different issues,
Yeah.
And multiple things we cannot even imagine. I mean, because we are not touched by one thing or another, so each individual, and I kind of related with the vaccine. Massive vaccination is one thing, but I think for me, I see it more in an individual thing. So whatever happens, yeah, we are all affected at different levels.
Absolutely. And there have been lots of challenges, haven't they, Ed? I mean, I think some people clearly have reacted and dealt with the situation better than others. But I think if we're honest with any one of us, I've dealt with some things quite well, probably, and other things not so well. There's a lot of the indirect consequences of this as well, aren't there? I mean, we lost our job and home for it, of course, and we're just two of millions. I mean, and a lot of that's only really just starting, isn't it? But I liked, who was it who said that about using things as a sort of kind of opportunities in a positive way? It's something we're going to look at more tomorrow, that, and particularly when we look at thought transformation. But one of the things I love about spiritual practice generally, and this isn't just Buddhism, and there are other more secular approaches to this as well, but whatever is happening to us, however negative it appears, there is always a positive way we can utilize it. Within our own spiritual development and the transformation of our mind. And it's something I do better at sometimes than others, if I'm really, really honest, when I'm dealing with problems, as we all do. And that's okay. That's part of the process. We keep chipping away, don't we? But that's sometimes I personally find enormously helpful to remind myself of. Yeah, Elizabeth, you say something? What was that?
The mind.
Oh, indeed. Indeed. Okay, right, we'll move on a bit now. But thanks for that. We'll be having discussions most sessions, and it sounds like people...
Sorry, Claire, you got a question?
Yes, please do, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that Lama Yeshe was very positive, wasn't he, in all his writings? I never met him, but his writings and the things that he said. And I remember reading a book, I think it's called What Do You Do When the Chocolate Runs Out? And that's a really positive and interesting book to read.
That sounds very Lama Yeshe. I would as well, as Claire's mentioned Lama Yeshe, he was, if people don't know, he was the original spiritual head and founder of the FBMT. Lama Zopa, who's the current spiritual director of the FBMT, was his disciple, was his student. And if you come across any of Lama Yeshe's books, though, I unfortunately, because of my age and when I came into it, I never actually met him. But I've read lots by him and seen videos and things, and he is an incredibly inspiring person to read or listen to, Lama Yeshe. And was wonderful at really connecting the Dharma and making it relevant to people in the West, I think. Which is how the FBMT really got going. But okay, I'm going to move on now and talk a little bit more about, just to conclude this, what's a very, very brief summary of the Four Noble Truths. And I'm going to talk now about the third and fourth ones. So we've already looked at the first two. And again, bear in mind what I said about that word suffering, that it's the translation of dukkha. And it's very, very broad term, and it just means problems, difficulties, sort of unsatisfactoriness, that kind of thing. So we started with the truth of suffering, which obviously you've been discussing, and the truth of origin, which we looked at very, very briefly. Now I'm going to move on to the third one, which is the truth of cessation. This is where the good news starts. I mean, if all we had was the first two noble truths, this would be pretty grim and depressing, wouldn't it? And there probably wouldn't be a lot of point to it. But the third one is the truth of cessation. And what this is saying, and the way that the Buddha explained it, it is possible to achieve genuine happiness, peace. It is possible. And to actually overcome suffering completely. However, and bearing in mind what I said earlier about the importance of being gentle and realistic, that is clearly a long, long way off. Yeah, we're very much in for this in the long haul, from a Buddhist point of view. But the good news is it's not an all or nothing thing. And we can improve things along the way. And that's what we're trying to do all the time through our practices. You know, we have to be realistic. I talked a bit about the origin of suffering being that fundamental misperception of reality. So there's this discrepancy between the way things exist in this empty and interdependent way within the flow of cause and effect, but the way they actually appear to us is much more solid and rigid and permanent and inherent and separate than is actually the case. And particularly important is this notion of an I, which I talked about, which creates this false sense of separation between ourselves and others. And that's what leads to attachment and aversion and all the other problems. We use the term afflictive emotions in Buddhism. But these are just mental states that cause us problems, that unsettle the mind, that lead to suffering for oneself and others. But at the root of that is that ignorance, that misperception of reality. That is overcome by realizing the empty and selfless nature of reality. And that is possible. And a lot of Buddhist practice is working up towards that. But obviously that's very, very advanced. It's certainly way beyond my level at the moment. And it's done through a combination of two things, that, and it is worth saying. One is the development of what's called calm abiding or single-pointed concentration. The Tibetan term for that is Shinei. The Sanskrit term is shamatha. There's all sorts of terms used for that, sometimes mental quiescence, meditative serenity, calm abiding. There are a lot of single-pointed concentration. There are lots of terms for it. That is developed through the kinds of practice that we did at the start, when we did the mindfulness of breathing practice. And as I said when I introduced that practice, that's kind of one half of the picture from a meditational point of view, is those kinds of practices and what's called stabilizing meditation. A lot of people do it on the breath, and that can be enormously effective. And the Buddha himself practiced that. This is a very good example of mindfulness of breathing. You can use lots of other objects, and for instance, a visualized image, like of a Buddha, for instance. Some people find it helpful with a candle flame. The nature of mind and the clear nature of mind can be a very effective object for that, although that's more tricky, but we're going to do that practice later on, so I'll talk us through that. But that's one half, is developing that single-pointed concentration and calm abiding. The other side, sometimes referred to as vipassana, is the insight side. And that is through, initially, we develop an understanding of that empty and interdependent nature, and we develop that conceptually, inferentially is another term. And that's something we're already working on, a lot of us, from now. But that has to be developed so it becomes more and more subtle and more solid, and it's kind of incontrovertible within our own minds, and more clear that understanding becomes. And eventually these two come together and conjoin. It's what's called the union of calm abiding and special insight. Yeah. And through that, it's possible to actually realize initially the emptiness of the self, which I talked about, which is particularly important, and then eventually the emptiness of all phenomena, so that we actually spontaneously experience that empty and interdependent nature, and ourselves are part of that. Now, that's the key to completely overcoming suffering, which is possible from a Buddhist point of view. and we're all encouraged to be working towards that. But as I've said, that is a long way off, and it's very, very important that we take heart and we proceed from little improvements we make within our lives in the here and now. And this is very, very relevant to the truth of cessation. One thing is, if we look at problems that we experience, I'll be talking about anger quite a bit tomorrow, and anger is considered particularly harmful in Buddhism because of the effect it can have, both on oneself and others. But there are lots of other things we could be talking about. Jealousy, we'll talk about depression a little bit as well, and things like that, and other harmful mental states. But most of us, if we really, really check within the course of our lives, have probably made some improvement with things like that, just as we mature. I personally worked on anger a lot when I first encountered the Dharma. It was the first thing I asked my teacher for advice on, was dealing with anger. It's kind of still there. I sometimes joke, from a Buddhist point of view, it's my karma. I sometimes point to the red hair, but whatever. But that was my nature, or it seemed to be my nature when I was younger. I had quite a lot of anger. I have made a lot of improvement with that. I mean, it's been huge actually over the years, as I think Sarah and other people who know me well would attest to. And it's very, very important we take heart from that. At its deepest level, and again, I'll be talking about this a bit more later, the mind, or the nature of our mind, our consciousness, is essentially pure. Yeah. Things like anger, jealousy, depression, negative thoughts towards others, none of these things are permanent. They're not our nature. All of these things can be reduced if we work on it. And Buddhism is very practical in that it presents very applicable antidotes to actually help us to deal with these things. And they can be reduced. Again, coming back to impermanence, these things are impermanent. They're not a permanent feature. At the same time, positive qualities, and the definition of a wholesome mental state, mental factor is a term that's sometimes used for, it's the opposite of the unwholesome ones, the negative ones. They're things that lead to more happiness for oneself and others in the long run. And there are also things that are aligned with wisdom, as opposed to being aligned with ignorance, which is what the negative ones are. They're much more in accord with that empty and interdependent nature. And if we think about things like love and compassion, particularly important, sometimes the connection between that, if you like, and the slightly more heady wisdom side, as I've talked about, emphasis isn't that obvious. But feeling love brings us more naturally in line with that interdependent nature with others. Yeah. If we're feeling the opposite, if we're feeling angry or hateful towards us, that exaggerates that false sense of separation between self and others. Yeah. So in this sense, the love and wisdom side of the path are actually very, very much interconnected, and they feed and support each other. Even though initially the wisdom side seems to be a bit more intellectual and the love and compassion side seems a bit more emotional, but these are connected and they do feed. And again, those things again are impermanent, which means they can be enhanced and increased. So it is possible to reduce the negative things and to increase the positive ones. And it's very, very important that we do check and draw inspiration from times where we've had any success with that. I mean, probably if we look back when we were children, there'd be all sorts of things used to get us really upset. I mean, in my case, it's like blind rage at times when I was a kid, but don't anymore. That's changed. Yeah, and that's a clue that we can keep working with that process. Yeah, and as we become more and more conscious and aware, we can keep working with that. So that's one thing, is to draw inspiration from this ability we clearly have to reduce things like anger and to increase things like love. Which will lead to greater happiness. Another thing which is relevant as well to this truth of cessation is there are certain times in our lives, and again, I'm going to be encouraging us to talk about this later, when we feel particularly calm and at peace. And we all experience this at times. Some of us get it in meditation. particularly just doing calm abiding meditation, like on the breath, if you persevere with that, and it's very important we don't expect too much too quickly with practices like that, and we'll still find we'll have better days and better sessions than others. But some people experience it when they're doing that kind of practice. I think most of us probably experience it more at other times in our life. It could be when we're going for a walk in the countryside. I went out of our door the other night and I was just looking at the sky. It was a really, really beautiful, clear night. And there was a thin crescent moon that had just come out. That's the time when I could suddenly feel that, when it's just like you're just sort of resting in the experience. And certainly compared to the way my mind is most of the time, there's a real sense of peace and being in the present moment, and really appreciating that. And for other people, it can be walk in the country. I mean, some people get it when they're playing sport, when they're very, very into that particular activity. I mean, some people do when they do a jigsaw puzzle, for instance. So that there are lots of times in life when we just become particularly calm and in the moment. And again, we can draw inspiration from experiences like that because it gives a clue of what we can achieve in a more stable sense in the long term. But as I say, we are going to be talking about that a little bit later, and I'll be asking people to share experiences like that. And we'll have a little look at what those experiences have in common, which is quite interesting. Particularly if we relate that to those three poisons I talked about of ignorance, attachment and aversion. I think what they particularly have in common is when attachment and aversion have kind of subsided temporarily, which certainly calm abiding meditation can bring about, but we can also experience that at other times of our life. Okay, so that's the truth of cessation. And now I'll move on to the fourth noble truth, which is the truth of the path. So I'm just checking how I am with time. Right, can you put up the handout now, Faye? Okay, so the fourth one is the truth of the path, which you've all got that, haven't you, on the handout? And this is, originally this was rooted in the teachings of the Buddha and obviously all the practitioners and lineage masters who've come since. And this is what we're encouraged to actually do to eventually reduce suffering initially and increase those positive states, positive qualities, and eventually to overcome it completely. There are actually different ways of presenting the path. The one I've put on the handout, the first one, is called the Noble Eightfold Path. This presentation is shared with a lot of the major Buddhist traditions. There are other presentations of the path that you'll find more specifically in Tibetan Buddhism, and I've put one just down at the bottom, which is the Six Perfections. That should be down at the bottom of that handout. There you go. That's in the Six Perfections. But we'll go back to the Noble Eightfold Path, and I'm going to talk about it in relation to that. Now, this is basically divided into three sections. And you can see that on the right as ethics, concentration, and wisdom. This is sometimes shown as a triangle. When it's shown like that, with one of those on each side of the triangle, ethics is always at the bottom. And there's a good reason for that, because it's the foundation of the path. Without ethics, all the rest of it's impossible. Yeah. I mean, you can develop things like concentration to some extent, but the whole path is built on good ethics. And the real foundation of ethics and what permeates the practice of ethics is compassion and caring about others. You'll see within that presentation, it does come up in other presentations of the path, but compassion and love aren't actually specifically mentioned if you look at the path, but they're implicit in all of it. And that's the driving force for all of this, and particularly ethics. And of course, the real foundation of ethics is really for having consideration for others. And it's based on the assumption that others essentially deserve and want the same kind of treatment that you want yourself. And as we can see, that is divided between right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Right speech is obviously very, very important. We have a very, very big effect on the world and others through our speech. And it's something, you know, it's very, very important that we take responsibility for that. Right action is all our physical actions, obviously, as we're interacting in the world. And then the other one is right livelihood, which has been there from the very, very beginning, traditionally in Buddhism. That can be a bit tricky. What it is really important is our way of earning a living. We try and make that something that isn't actually at odds with our spiritual practice. If we can, I mean, if it can actually enhance our practice, and obviously a lot of people choose professions that involve helping others. Obviously speaking to Zoe earlier, who's a nurse, it would be an example of that. But not everybody has the option of doing that, or it isn't necessarily the best thing for them. And again, it's very, very important we're gentle and realistic. Being an assassin obviously wouldn't be good from a Buddhist point of view. I think that goes without saying. But with quite a lot of professions, it isn't always that clear cut. And again, we mustn't beat ourselves up over this. Everybody's got to eat. I remember once when I was teaching this in a class and there was a disabled lady sat in the class. And I noticed as I was talking about that, she started going bright red. And I spoke to her at the end of the class and said, oh, what was the matter with that? And she'd suddenly got really, really self-conscious because she had a job that was working for the Ministry of Defence. Yeah. Now, it was a lovely, lovely lady, and being realistic, because of her physical condition, there were only so many jobs open for her. That was something that somebody had helped find a job for her. And as I explained to her, that certainly isn't something she needed to feel ashamed about. You can still, within any job like that, do an enormous amount of good. Yeah, I mean, in our job with the National Trust, we quite often crossed over with the Navy because there was a naval monument on our National Trust property. And the last time I spoke to them, they'd just been delivering food in Africa, for instance. So a lot of things aren't bad per se, livelihood. But it is good to think about it and try and ensure as much as you can that your livelihood and your way of earning a living is compatible with your spiritual practice. Okay. Then if we move to the next session, this all comes under the heading of concentration. Now, it starts with right effort, that section. Now, in fact, effort applies to all of them. It's traditionally put in the middle section, but that applies to all of them. The spiritual path does take effort, but it's very, very important, and often the word's put before that, as it is when we get to the 6 perfections, you can see underneath, effort has to be joyous. It's not like a grind and sort of, you know, again, that can become a problem. We try to kind of take joy in our practices. Inevitably, that's easier at some times than others. And again, that's just being real. I mean, I find some days meditating things the highlight of my day. At other times, I have to make more effort to do it. That's inevitable, and that comes. But we try and do that lightly and joyfully. And I think the more we appreciate the real benefits of the path, the easier that becomes to actually take joy in it. But again, it varies, and not always. You know, it's again, we have to be realistic. The middle two there are right mindfulness and right concentration. Mindfulness, which is the first one there, what that actually refers to is the kind of mindfulness that, if people are familiar with the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, for instance, he emphasizes a lot. As we're going about our day, we try to be as mindful as we possibly can of exactly what's going on around us, but particularly what's going on within our inner world. What we're actually thinking, what we're actually feeling, how we're reacting to things. That is the real key to making our other practices real and meaningful. When we're applying antidotes, for instance, for afflictive emotions, the more aware we are of what's really going on in our mind and how we're reacting to things, the more effectively we can then actually work on dealing with it. So it's a very, very important quality of mindfulness. I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about being mindful when we're washing up, for instance. And then the third one is right concentration. there we are talking about the kind of concentration that we're developing through that calm abiding practice that I've already talked about. And I talked about how that's important eventually to realize emptiness, but that's talking about really developing that single pointed concentration. I'm terribly sorry, I'm going to have to nip to the loo. I'm really sorry about this. I should have gone with the break, but I'm just going to nip to the loo for I'll just be a minute. If anybody's got any questions or anything they want to say, if you want to say now, Sarah's here anyway, and you can have a little discussion about that. I'll only be a couple of minutes. Sorry about that.
No difficult questions, please. Everybody okay with what's been said so far? I think we've got another 12, 13 minutes, I think.
I just wanted to say when Martin mentioned, I can't remember what he was saying, but when I was telling the girls earlier that I had a meltdown yesterday. I was feeling depressed. I was feeling well, everything, but I completely forgot anything to apply what I've learned so far, and and I've been taught. What I'll say is staying in the now. When he was talking about walking, doing sport, doing a jigsaw, because those actions concentrate your focus, your mind on doing something. Walking, you're careful what you do. Doing the jigsaw, you concentrate on that. So you are in the moment, and that usually kind of neutralize any
total self-centeredness that we can sometimes fall into without realizing.
Yeah. So yesterday the same is because I was fears came up, and I don't like to be driven by fears, but suddenly you start when emotions or feelings, depending what you want to call or dissociate them, arise. It's when you start to think about either the past or the future.
Yes, it's not the present. Then, is it?
If you stay in the right moment where you're here, you're in your room, you're in front of your computer, or you're making a cup of tea, very popular in England,
very popular
in the UK, have a cup of tea and everything will be better. But that's the point, being in the now, in the moment, and that usually neutralizes those emotions that completely overflow me yesterday. So as you say, we all got out cheap.
Absolutely.
I heard all of that, and that's spot on, and that's what we're going to be discussing actually the next session. And it's partly why people find things like doing mindfulness of breathing so good for stress reduction and relaxation. It is important, though, from a Buddhist point of view, that that's only temporary. And it can still bring enormous benefits, but attachment and aversion have kind of stopped for the time being, or at least the grosser levels of attachment and aversion. They can get very, very subtle. But that is giving a clue of what we can achieve in a more lasting sense, definitely. And through this union of that with the insight that I've talked about. But I heard that, and that's great, and I agree very much. I think that's spot on. And that's what we're going to be discussing in the next session. So we'll wait for that. But thanks for that. That was really good. Okay, sorry about that. So we'll now carry on. Can you put the hand up again? Handout up again, Faye? Okay, so then we'll move on to the next part. We've looked at those first two parts with the ethics and concentration. What we will see is that the first part, ethics, is mainly that here we're talking about physical actions, including speech. These are actions of the body. And we have to take responsibility for that initially. That's where we have to start, really. It then goes deeper, and as we'll see, all the subsequent ones, the concentration parts I've just talked about, and the wisdom part that I'm going to talk about now. And here we're really talking about the mind. And from a Buddhist point of view, it's the mind we're really working on transforming at a deeper level. All our actions, all our physical actions, of course, arise originally from intentions that arise within the mind. So we'll now move on to the wisdom part, and I've already talked about this a little bit. And as I said earlier, this has to be combined really from a Buddhist point of view with the concentration part to really, really address those fundamental problems, those fundamental causes of our problems, that ignorance and attachment and aversion. You'll see there's two there, there's right view and right thought. Right view actually includes all sorts of things. And again, as everything with Buddhism, there's the more gross and it goes to the more subtle. Just having a basic understanding of cause and effect, for instance. Understanding that anger will lead to problems and difficulties. Understanding that love will help reduce problems and difficulties. These come within right view. But at its deepest level, right view includes that thing I've already talked about, which is that realization of the empty and interdependent nature of reality. And that's the really most important right view, because it's that will overcome those root causes really of our problems and difficulties. And then the other one there is right thought, and that generally is explained in terms of our motivation. It's a good thing to check as we're going, but again, without driving ourselves mad, and be realistic. I like to think I'm a kind person, but if I'm really honest, I'm not sure I ever have totally pure motivation. There's always a little bit of ego in there. Where if we get disappointed because people aren't as grateful as we expect, for instance, when we help them, that's a giveaway that probably the motivation wasn't totally pure. And again, of course, that's very, very normal. But we have to try and become aware of that. And we try and make our motivations as pure as we possibly can when we're engaged with any activity. I explained at the start when we were doing the meditation, from a Mahayana Buddhist point of view, the best kind of motivation we can have is that aspiration to work towards enlightenment so we can be a maximum benefit for all sentient beings. And that actually incorporates our own welfare as well, automatically, actually, if we take that on board. But that's the best kind of motivation we can have. But we have to work on that and gradually. And again, if going back to mindfulness, it takes mindfulness to be really, really aware, our motivation. Certainly I can convince myself that my motivation is more pure than it is sometimes, I think, probably. But as I say, sometimes it's a giveaway. I'll give one example of that, actually. One of the things Sarah and I do in normal times, this has been off because of COVID, we do sing songs for elderly and special needs people. Now, generally, people are very nice and appreciative when we do that. And you have to watch that, because that can build the ego up a little bit, of course, that again makes you vulnerable for fall. And I don't want to knock it, because I'm proud we do that. I enjoy doing that. There's a lot of love and compassion in our motives for doing that. But there's that little bit of ego as well. And I remember one occasion, one old lady, not everybody always likes it. And we deal quite a lot with people with dementia, and I think people will know it's a bit like with young children sometimes with people with dementia. There's no filter there. They'll just say exactly what they think or feel. And I remember one lady once really turning on me, absolutely savaging me about everything, about my guitar playing, about my singing. And initially it didn't feel very, very nice. But as soon as I caught that from a Buddhist point of view, it was a very good chance to look at my exaggerated notions of I, and that's always useful anyway. But also to really, really check my motivation for doing that. And it's all about trying to help the other, not looking for appreciation ourselves. And that can be difficult. So that, again, I say we have to be realistic and work with that. But our motivation is very, very important from a Buddhist point of view. And the more we do things through, if you like, a pure, more selfless motivation, the less vulnerable it actually makes us to later feelings of disappointment or dissatisfaction. It can also just, if you're ever doing something that you naturally feel nervous about, it can apply, say, if you're giving a talk or a teaching or something like that, but there's lots of other times in life. And His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, is very strong on this. A really good antidote to that is to really reflect on your motivation at the start and think, no, I'm just doing this to help others, and get away from thinking about yourself too much. And it can be very, very effective, that. But in brief, anyway, that's the Noble Eightfold Path. I'm not going to talk any more about that. I'm just going to invite now, if people have any questions, or again, anything you want to share based on anything I've said, then please feel free to do so. Do you want to take the handout down, Faye, so I can see the screen? Thanks.
I have a question. I don't know which lady was talking about when you get all emotional and something's being triggered within the mind, like and how do you restore it back to balance when your emotions are all over the place and out of control in that moment? Do you just let the emotions ride, or do you have to let them ride, or before you can come back into balance?
To some extent, I think you do have to go with it, don't you? Again, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think to some extent you do. If you try and force things too much, that can create problems in itself, can't it? Mm-hmm. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because when you talk about the right mind and concentration and trying to get back into balance. So, but if you're not accepting that moment of that emotion coming up and trying to get rid of it, that's not really helpful, really, is it? Because you're trying to change what is happening in that moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think this is a question of skillful means. Sometimes it comes up a lot with anger, and it used to be the thinking here that oh, if you get angry, you're better off just letting it sort of flow and all manifest. And the thinking, even in Western psychology, is that that's a good thing, and it actually just creates a cause for more anger in the future. So I think to a certain extent, you do have to work on trying to reduce things. But yeah, again, you have to do it realistically. And not just, I mean, the thing with anger, for instance, we'll talk about this tomorrow, it's not to bottle it up like sticking a cork in a jar and just kind of hold it in and not let it out. The idea is to really look at it honestly and deconstruct it.
Right.
Is that helpful?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. Right, we'll do a little bit of meditation now with Sarah. Well, I'm looking at the time. No, I don't want to. I'll tell you what. Shall we? Because we've run over a little bit. Are people okay if we have a slightly shorter break this session? Yeah. Is that okay with people if we make the break 10 minutes? Do please stick your hand up or something if that's problematic, because I understand people might have other commitments and things. And so we'll take a short break now and we'll come back at 5 past.